In 1907, a man walked into a bank in New York City carrying a suitcase filled with cash. Not a check, not a bond certificate. Actual currency, stacks of different bank printed by dozens of different banks, in different colors, different sizes, each with different promises written across the paper. The banker refused to accept half of them, not because they were counterfeit, not because they were damaged, but because they came from institutions he did not trust. At the time, this was normal. Before 1913, before the creation of the Federal Reserve, before the modern dollar system we take for granted, America did not have a single national currency. There was no uniform money that everyone agreed on, no standardized bills backed by a central authority. Instead, the country operated on something far stranger. Thousands of private currencies circulated at the same time, banknotes issued by individual banks, company scrip, railroad money, merchant tokens, even handwritten IOUs passed between neighbors. Some of it was accepted everywhere. Some of it was worthless the moment you crossed a county line. And yet somehow, the economy functioned. I first came across this while trying to understand a single object. A faded piece of paper I found inside an antique ledger at an estate sale in Pennsylvania. It was folded carefully, almost ceremonially, as if someone had intended it to be preserved. When I opened it, I expected a letter. Instead, I found money, but not the kind we recognize. It was a banknote issued by something called the Farmers and Mechanics Bank of Lancaster, dated 1856. The paper was thin, almost cloth-like. At the top was an engraved image of a farmer plowing a field, while a steam locomotive passed in the background, and beneath it, a promise, payable to bearer on demand, in specie, not dollars. That word kept appearing in the records I began reading, in account books, merchant ledgers, government reports. Specie meant gold or silver, coins. The banknote itself wasn't the money. It was a promise that the bank would give you real metal if you brought the note back, which meant something unsettling. Money, at the time, depended entirely on trust. Not trust in a government, not trust in a centralized system, but trust in individual institutions, banks, that could fail. Overnight, I began looking deeper into how this system actually worked. What I found wasn't just complicated. It was almost impossible to imagine today. By the 1850s, there were over 1,600 state-chartered banks operating across the United States. Each one printed its own currency. Each one designed its own notes. Each one made its own promises about redemption. Some were stable, many were not, and because there was no national standard, $1 from one bank might be worth less than $1 from another. Traveling merchants carried something called a banknote reporter, a thick weekly publication that listed every known bank in the country and rated the reliability of their notes. You could open it to a page and see entries like this: Merchants Bank of St. Louis, notes accepted at 95 cents on the dollar. Bank of Georgia discounted 10%. Bank of Western Texas, uncertain. Redemption doubtful. Imagine that. Imagine needing a guidebook just to know whether your money was actually money. And yet, people navigated this system every day. They learned which banks were trustworthy, which regions accepted which notes, which institutions had enough gold reserves to honor their promises. The entire economy functioned on a network of personal knowledge and reputation. But here is what I found most disturbing: that the instability wasn't accidental. It was built into the system. Banks were allowed to issue far more notes than they had gold to redeem, as long as people didn't all demand specie at once. The illusion held, but when they did, when fear spread, the entire structure could collapse overnight. They called these moments bank runs, and they happened with alarming frequency. The Panic of 1837, the Panic of 1857, the Panic of 1873. Each time, banks suspended payments. Citizens lined up outside doors that would never reopen. Paper notes that had once represented wealth suddenly became worthless scraps. And yet after each collapse, the system restarted. Not because it was stable, but because there was no alternative, no central authority to intervene, no lender of last resort, no standardized currency to restore confidence. Just thousands of independent institutions trying to maintain trust in a fragile network of promises. Official histories describe this period as chaotic, inefficient, prone to fraud, and they aren't wrong. Counterfeit. Banknotes were so common that entire industries formed around detecting them. Publications like the Counterfeit Detector circulated weekly, listing known fake designs and warning merchants what to watch for. Some counterfeit bills were so convincing that even experienced bankers couldn't tell them apart from the real ones. But there is another pattern that emerges. When you look closely, despite the chaos, trade expanded, railroads spread across the continent, factories multiplied, cities grew rapidly, markets became increasingly interconnected. Economic activity didn't stall because of monetary instability. In many ways, it accelerated, which raises a question historians rarely explore. If the system was as dysfunctional as it is portrayed, how did it support one of the fastest periods of economic expansion in American history? Why did a decentralized network of private currencies coexist with rapid industrial growth? And why did that system persist for decades before finally being replaced? The official explanation focuses on stability. The narrative says that by the early 20th century, the banking system had become too fragile to sustain a modern economy. Financial panics were disrupting markets, businesses needed predictable credit, a national currency was necessary to ensure confidence. That is the story we are taught. But when I began tracing the timeline more closely, something else emerged. The push for a centralized currency did not begin after a crisis, it began during one. Specifically, during the Panic of 1907, and the events surrounding that panic reveal a pattern that feels almost deliberate, because when the banking system nearly collapsed that year, there was no Federal Reserve to intervene, no central authority to stabilize the markets. Only one man stepped forward, a private banker J.P. Morgan. What he did in those weeks would change the entire structure of American money forever. In October of 1907, the American financial system came within hours of total collapse. It began quietly. A failed attempt by two speculators to corner the market on United Copper Company stock triggered a chain reaction. Trust evaporated almost instantly. Depositors rushed to withdraw funds from banks and trust companies across New York. Within days, lines stretched down entire city blocks. Men in suits stood beside laborers in worn coats. Women clutched passbooks with trembling hands. Everyone waiting for the same thing to turn paper into certainty, because in that moment, the fundamental truth of the system became visible. The money in their pockets was not actually money, it was a promise. And if enough people demanded that promise be fulfilled at the same time, the entire structure could disintegrate. Banks began suspending withdrawals, payments froze, businesses couldn't access credit, factories shut down because payrolls could not be met. By November, the country was staring at a financial paralysis that threatened to halt the entire economy. There was no central authority to intervene, no Federal Reserve, no national currency system capable of stabilizing trust, so the responsibility fell to a single private individual, John Pierpont Morgan. He was 70 years old at the time, a banker with immense personal wealth and even greater influence over the financial system. For weeks, Morgan worked almost without sleep. He summoned the heads of major banks to his library on Madison Avenue, locked the doors, refused to let them leave until they agreed to pool their resources. He personally examined balance sheets by lamplight, decided which institutions would be saved and which would be allowed to fail. At one point, he ordered his associates to physically prevent bankers from leaving the room until they signed a rescue. AGREEMENTA, private citizen, had become, in effect, the central bank of the United States, and it worked. Morgan's coordinated effort restored confidence. Panic subsided. Depositors slowly returned their funds to banks. The immediate crisis ended, but something had changed. For the first time, the entire country had witnessed how fragile the monetary system truly was, and more importantly, how dependent it had become on the decisions of a single, powerful individual. In the months that followed, a new consensus began to form among political leaders and financial elites. The system could not continue like this, not because it lacked complexity, but because it lacked control. In 1908, Congress passed the Aldrich-Freeland Act, creating the National Monetary Commission to study banking systems around the world and recommend reforms. The man appointed to lead it was Senator Nelson Aldrich of Rhode Island, a figure deeply connected to the most powerful banking families in America. For 2 years, Aldrich and his commission traveled through Europe examining central banking models. They studied the Bank of England, the Reichsbank in Germany, the Banque de France. Each of these institutions shared something the United States lacked: a centralized authority capable of controlling the money supply. In November of 1910, Aldrich convened a secret meeting. It took place at a private hunting club on Jekyll Island, off the coast of Georgia. The attendees traveled under assumed names. Even the train car they used had its windows covered to prevent identification. Among those present were representatives of the most influential financial institutions in the country: J.P. Morgan and Company, Kuhn Loeb, the National City Bank of New York. The goal was simple: to design a new monetary system, one that would eliminate the instability of decentralized bank-issued currencies, one that would concentrate authority over money creation, one that would ensure that no future financial panic would depend on the intervention of a single private banker. What emerged from that meeting would become the blueprint for the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Officially, the new system was presented as a solution to chaos, a way to stabilize currency, prevent bank runs, provide liquidity during crises. But when you examine the details, another pattern becomes visible. The Federal Reserve did not simply standardize money. It transformed what money actually was. Before 1913, most currency in circulation represented direct claims on physical assets, gold or silver held by banks. After 1913, currency increasingly represented something else: debt. Federal Reserve notes were issued, not as claims on specific reserves, but as liabilities backed by government bonds and the credit of the banking system. Money became abstract, detached from physical redemption, no longer a promise of metal, but a promise of confidence. And this shift had consequences that extended far beyond banking. Because when money ceases to represent a tangible asset, it becomes something more powerful and more unstable. It becomes a tool of policy, a mechanism through which entire economies can be expanded or contracted. Before 1913, the supply of money was constrained by the amount of gold and silver available. Expansion required physical resources. After 1913, expansion required something far less concrete: trust. Trust that the institutions controlling currency would act responsibly. Trust that debt could continue to grow without undermining stability. Trust that the new centralized system would prevent the very crises it was designed to solve. But there is another question that lingers beneath the official narrative, one that emerges when you examine what disappeared alongside the creation of a national currency, because the transition to centralized money did not simply standardize banknotes. It erased an entire ecosystem of local financial practices. Community credit systems, merchant tokens, cooperative lending networks, informal arrangements that had functioned for generations. By the 1920s, most of these alternative forms of currency had vanished, not because they failed, but because they were no longer permitted to exist. Laws regulating legal tender became increasingly strict. Only federally authorized currency could be used for official transactions. Private note issuance was effectively eliminated. A decentralized monetary world, messy, unstable, but locally adaptable, was replaced by a centralized one, stable, uniform, and controlled. And this raises a question that historians rarely ask: was the shift to national currency purely about preventing chaos? Or was it about consolidating power over something far more fundamental than money itself? Because once you control the currency, you control something deeper. You control the pace of economic life, the conditions under which credit can be created, the boundaries of what communities can do independently. Before 1913, money was fragmented, local, deeply tied to personal relationships and regional trust. After 1913, it became centralized, standardized, and increasingly abstract. A transformation so complete that within a generation, most Americans could no longer imagine that any other system had ever existed. And yet, fragments of that earlier world still survive, if you know where to look. Old merchant tokens buried in antique drawers, company script tucked inside family Bibles, banknotes printed by institutions that disappeared more than a century ago. Each one a reminder of something we rarely consider: that for most of American history, money was not a single, unified thing. It was a network of promises, and once you begin to see that pattern, another question emerges: not why the old system was replaced, but whether it was ever truly forgotten, or simply made invisible. Because Every modern dollar still carries a phrase that dates back to that earlier era, a phrase that once meant something very literal, payable to bearer. Today, it is just a formality, but once, it was a promise that could determine whether a piece of paper represented wealth